What you're about to watch is a conversation between myself, Dr. Madhavassetti, and David Helfrich, all journalists who also hold a bit of a philosophical lens when it comes to exploring the many layers to current events. Now, typically when legacy media explores current events, it's often through this propagandized lens of finding who the good guy is, who the bad guy is, and how all of that relates to who benefits in the story of power at the end of the day. This leaves many layers of culture, power agendas, war profiteering, and this sort of thing out of the conversation entirely. But there are many layers to unpack if we truly want to understand and make sense of current events, why they happen, and what we can do to potentially change our future outcomes and our overall societal culture. So this conversation will seek to unpack many of these complex layers to perhaps give us a greater awareness around how we might go about thinking about conflicts, why they happen, and what it means to us in our overall human story. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, so guys, I know when it comes to this Ukraine and Russia sort of conflict, there's been a lot of different perspectives and different ways of looking at this going around. And, it seems like it'd be a good sort of conversation, almost exercise in sense making and in feeling things out and bringing in multiple perspectives to kind of explore not just the facts, which is one way of looking at things where we're going to explore the facts. We're going to explore who's got the motivations, what's going on. But there's oftentimes deeper things that happen, like why are we fighting as humans? Like what's the condition? What's the nature of us as we go through this? What reflection points can we think about? Beyond the conflicts that Russians might believe or that Ukrainians might believe, is there deeper agendas sometimes at play when it comes to war profiteering, when it comes to why these agendas continue on and how they create divide, even from a social engineering point of view. And we want to recognize, of course, off the top that it's in all of this, there's people suffering, right? Which is why we're trying to have these conversations from a larger view as humans, trying to examine what is really the core of why we do this? Why does this happen? Why is there war, invasion right now here in 2022? When really we should be coming off of if you want to look at it as a global crisis of lockdowns everywhere, we should be saying, okay, guys, let's come back together and rebuild community and communicate and do this. But instead we're fighting in some ways. And I just kind of wanted to contextualize with that and say, let's kind of unpack this and let's explore this. So I'm going to kind of throw it, whoever feels like they want to begin with some of that. What do you guys think?
I do think it's important to, whenever we're having these discussions and there's an outbreak of war, which is happening right now in Ukraine, we always have to take a measured step back, right? Because I think the reflexive tendency is always to align with some kind of nationalistic posture or try to make sense of what's happening based on what we think we know about the situation. And if we're not sort of exacting a heightened level of scrutiny on media, then essentially we're just receiving downloads from the media and we're just regurgitating what they're saying. Mm-hmm. So what that is, if you're in the United States, clearly you're saying that Russia's the worst actor in the world, Putin is the biggest monster to ever walk the earth. And people are calling for the US to get involved now in the military conflict. If you're in Russia, the message is going to be that the United States is akin to the great Satan and they're the most evil nation on earth. And, we had to act militarily to thwart Western aggression. The truth is always somewhere in between that black and white paradigm. And what I think is encouraging, though, is in the modern world, particularly with the utilization of social media and people who can just put a camera on like this and speak to each other from around the world, we have an opportunity to sort of rebuke just the standard bearers of Western media or Russian media and speak directly to each other as people, as citizens of the world. Americans can speak to Russians, and if they do that, my suspicion is we'll find infinitely more commonality with each other than perhaps our governments and our media would like us to believe. But without that effort, we are often just being sort of drawn into a hypnosis to where we're repeating, I think, the mistakes of the past, to we're demonizing and vilifying the other without trying to find commonality there.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Look, it's always It's always tough to follow David. Um, uh, I think what you said in the beginning, Joe, is really important. For everyone who's listening, look, we're acknowledging, that suffering is happening in Ukraine, and that is what's driving this conversation. Is why is it happening? So, despite where this conversation goes in terms of who's to blame or what's really happening, I want to be very clear that that is happening, and it's a tragedy. And as we're saying here, why is it happening? And it's a very large onion to peel, depending on how you want to categorize it. And I do believe that these kinds of nationalistic posturing exercises will only serve to hide the deeper meaning behind this conflict. So, like every side to an argument, like every argument, there's more than one side. And it is really, really difficult, honestly, if you go deep enough, to suggest that one side is right and one side is wrong. This is a back and forth tug of war between nation states that have been happening probably since the beginning of time in humanity. And now it's just being labeled with states like Russia, Ukraine, NATO, EU. Before it was, Kingdom A against Kingdom B. It was the same thing. So what I really find interesting here is when we immediately go, like you said, to Putin is the devil and is doing horrible things. But we have to be really, really clear here. I mean, he was brought to this position from lots and lots of aggressive action by the United States, NATO, and the EU, going back at least 22 years from the time where NATO expanded its nation states that were participating back to 1999, where Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic were brought in to NATO, and then that followed, 5 years later, when Romania and the Balkan states were added to NATO. And then in 2008, at the Bucharest summit meeting of NATO, the West basically said we're going to bring on the Ukraine and Georgia, which was an incredible incursion into Russian national security. So before I go on, I want to make sure, are we all in agreement with those factual historical positions? Is that how you guys see it too? Is that what happened? Because that's the way I know.
For sure, 100%. I think what's frustrating is that we're not getting that historical context when when media is presenting this issue. Just sort of, if you just watched CNN or Fox, they would think this conflict kind of came out of nowhere, magically just happened, and Putin just woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine.
Right.
But laid out there is a historical precedent that was set decades ago, to where the United States and NATO did make a decision that they were going to provoke Russia and essentially get as close to the red line as possible. Because again, Putin made it very clear, he's made it very clear for decades now, that Ukraine is a red line for Russia. Meaning, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, that is an existential threat, as Putin has described it. And if you are interested in preventing nuclear war, you should take that seriously, again, because this isn't to say that Putin is somehow a great guy or, is a good actor on the world stage. I don't believe he is. I think he has imperialist intentions, like a lot of corrupt leaders. However, when somebody draws a red line, we have to try to empathize and understand, okay, why are they drawing in a red line? Why does Putin consider Ukraine and becoming a NATO member as an existential threat? And the reason is because that would create nuclear weapons, perhaps, or militarize directly on Russian borders. And as we discussed previously, Joe, we know what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Russia was trying to militarize in Cuba. We consider that an existential threat in the red line, and that almost brought us to nuclear conflict. So when you sort of ponder the question of what is there to gain by trying to force Ukraine into NATO, which, if we're being honest, Ukraine probably wouldn't pass muster as a NATO member anyway. So what is the benefit there to try to provoke Russia into a conflict? Other than warmongers across the world in a deep state that has really pined for a conflict with Russia for decades and decades. And why this doesn't make sense, again, what's interesting here is there's actually an intersectionality between Donald Trump and Barack Obama that people are not acknowledging. When Barack Obama was running for president against Mitt Romney kept insisting that Russia was the biggest threat to the United States. And Obama was saying, absolutely not, Russia, the Cold War is over, Mr. Romney, the 1970s and 80s, they want their foreign policy back. Alike, Donald Trump actually made the cardinal sin of saying, what if we got along with Russia? Yeah. Why would that be so bad? And people were just outraged by this, right? By the notion that we could actually get along with Russia, right? The evil ex-Soviet Union. But if you think about it, and if you do a historical analysis, if it wasn't for Russia, the Third Reich would never have been defeated on the Eastern Front. They were, we worked in concert with them to win World War II. So this notion that there's no middle ground or no commonality we could ever have with Russia, I think is reckless and indicative of a much darker agenda at play here.
Yeah, Joe, what do you got?
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to derail.
Put down your coffee, man, and say something.
Well, this is a lovely tea, a lovely ginger turmeric tea, actually. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to derail from like kind of the point you were going to try and make, Madhava, but I have a couple of different areas to think about this, and I guess what I'll go with first is sort of this the story of like Majid Nawaz, who's the the former Islamic sort of radical when he was in his youth that eventually came out of that and had a massive ideological shift while he was in jail, and his story's been going around quite a bit over the last few years, and he talks of something that really deeply resonated with me because it's something I've felt for a large chunk of my life, and it's something that drives a lot of the work that we do with Collective Evolution and also the Pulse, which is that our existing systems of politics, our existing systems of government, our existing infrastructures of defense, they can't solve these challenges in the way that the average person might feel makes sense. And his example of that is after becoming no longer radicalized as basically what he would refer to as kind of like an Islamic terrorist that's nonviolent. That's someone who would try and overthrow governments, clandestinely and get people to swap over and do that kind of stuff. He said that after he did all that, he went around to governments around the world and he met with world leaders, like American world leaders, Canadian world leaders, different leaders in Europe. And he learned, it took him 10 years to come to the conclusion that talking with these world leaders and presenting them with different ideas and appealing through conversation and through ideological shifts and looking at it and saying, look, this isn't about force. We can't go in and just install a military in one of these countries. Of course, they're going to fight you back. Like if you go with force like this, you're never going to change anything. And he came to the conclusion, like the existing systems cannot solve these problems. Right. And it's through this, which is again, something we've been talking about a lot, where it's like, this is why we're having this conversation, because if we stick to this concept of, well, Russia's just bad and the US has to, maybe we believe, the US has to go and do something about Russia. But it's like, are we always just going to take this like violent posturing sort of approach? Or it's like, is it upon people to start having it like, how else can we go about solving what's going on? And again, I don't believe that anybody has the answer. It's just something where we're engaging in like a conversation. And so, kind of as I'm listening to what we're going through here, that's one of the pieces going through my mind is like, can we step outside of almost like this, our past shows us this, our history shows us that, which is true, but it's like, can we also act differently? And if so, what will that take? Like, how can we do that?
Yeah, well, we can, if we're allowed to do so. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is that we're being indoctrinated by posturing against, communism, Russia, all of this stuff. We are being we're being directed towards taking these stances, that can be tweeted on Facebook, like this is what I believe, and because we get inundated with that kind of narrative, we feel it's our responsibility as good Americans or good Canadians to get on board.
Yeah.
So unless we can see through that indoctrination, we're not going to be able to look at this more deeply. So I think that it is important to understand that we are looking at things through a lens, as you were saying, David, with media. We don't really know what's going on. I'm not saying that people in Ukraine are not getting routed. I'm saying that we're looking at it through a lens. And this lens, to me, is more and more distorted towards this nationalistic us versus them back and forth. And knowing that, we can still look at history. And, what I was laying out there was, what happened up to 2008. And then in 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine, and we took out a Russian-leaning autocrat and put in someone who is more Western-oriented.
Yeah.
And, what happened next? Russia took Crimea for a very important reason, because they smelled what was going on. And there's a really important naval base there. I think it's called Sevastopol. And knowing full well, Putin realized that, the incursion was happening. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that one way to break free of this illusion coming from mainstream is to actually look at the events that led to this, which is the first step in unpeeling the onion, or peeling the onion. And, why is it happening now? This is a really, really good question. Why now?
Yeah.
This happened in 2014. All of this stuff is going on. It's been 8 years. Well, this summer, and I'm really sorry I missed your conversation. I would like to have been a part of it when you and David were talking before. But, we've been taunting them, we've been taunting them for a long time. The British ran a destroyer through the Black Sea as almost a threat to the UK, or at least being perceived that way. Of course, if you were, look, if that happened to us on our coastal waters, we'd be pissed off.
Yeah.
So many of the wars, honestly, many of the wars on this planet have been caused by the United States. I mean, we have to really, really understand that is actually what's going on, whether it's from, regime overthrowing of regimes to put in our own. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? I mean, we hear only about 1/10 of what's really happening behind the scenes. And look, and here's where we can get a little bit more metaphysical, right? Like, if you were an army, what would you want? You would want an enemy. That's your job, is to fight.
Yeah.
Right. That's how it all works. And, I'd like to go right into the metaphysics here, or unless anybody else wants to say something.
David, what you got?
Well, yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. I think there's been provocation on both sides. Russia has for a while been, flying over Swedish airspace, for example, and what has been also sort of a taunting posture. I think what we have is a situation where nobody wants to give any concessions whatsoever. And when you're in that situation, conflict is imminent. And as Madhava pointed out, I mean, to speak about the crisis in Ukraine right now without the context of what happened in the late 90s and then in Crimea in 2014 is robbing us of historical nuance and context that is vital. And one thing I do want to also point out here is that, Hillary Clinton has been making rounds in the media lately, and she actually went on television the other day and suggested that we should arm neo-Nazi factions in eastern Ukraine to push back against Putin and Russia, and basically have them retreat back to Russia and get out of eastern Ukraine. And she actually likened this to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan when the United States funded the Mujahideen, which later became Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We all know that story, what happened there. But this notion that Hillary Clinton and people like her would not be learning from these egregious mistakes that caused millions of lives, and would essentially be saying, let's double down and do the exact same thing here and militarize with a neo-Nazi fascist group that could essentially become more powerful than people might realize and then overtake Ukraine, would be a catastrophic disaster. So we have leaders who are stubborn, or so stubborn in terms of doubling down on the mistakes of the past and essentially saying, we need to replicate the same blueprint of regime change, and arming just horrible factions simply because they are opposed to Russia creates a never-ending cycle of destruction, war, that, if unchecked and unchallenged, will precipitate into nuclear conflict in World War III. And Joe, I did want to mention one thing, because you brought up something very important about Majid Nawaz. One thing he also said recently was that when he was radicalized, the thing that actually started to warm his heart was the largest human rights organizations coming out and saying, hey, listen, Majid and these other people should not be detained because they're essentially just speaking. They're just exercising their freedom of expression. Now, their views may be radical and extreme, but they're not actually acting on those views. And Majid remarked that he was like, this was the first time in my life that somebody actually came to the defense of my individual rights and expression.
Yeah.
And that was actually the beginning of him blossoming into the person he is today, who I think is a champion of liberal order and individual rights and human rights. And imagine if we sort of replicated that methodology to all of our so-called enemies, and we tried to understand exactly where they were coming from, why they feel so tense, why they feel so angry towards us, if we're the United States, and actually make some concessions, right? Because in a negotiation on the world stage, if you're really engaged in meaningful diplomacy, you don't get everything you want. You make concessions. You understand. You empathize with what the other side. What are the primary motivators of your counterparts? And you try to reach a middle ground. And I think here there has been such an egregious neglect and rebuke of that process, of that diplomatic process, to try to warm the hearts of people who could find some commonality. It does make you wonder and ponder why we are at where we're at now. And, as Madhava questioned, why is this happening now? We can speculate as to that, but certainly it's very clear that there has been no cooler minds prevailing here. This has been a situation where nobody wants to give an inch. And I think there's been a intentional provocation.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Joe, did you want to jump in before I said something?
Well, I know you wanted to go metaphysical for a sec, which is good. What I wanted to kind of, just before we kind of dive there, it's like what you're talking about, David, with Majid's story is like him having, sort of an expansion of his empathizing with humans around the world, right? A shift in his worldview in many ways. And then going back to his conclusion that I wasn't able to bring, that type of dialogue, that type of peace, that type of getting past this cold, stuck system of politics, right? I wasn't able to bring that to leaders and have them appeal to that understanding that, these people are radicalized and upset for this reason, that whatever it might be. But he's like, I couldn't get that through to that machine, to that system that's up there, right? And it's in that machine, it's in that system where we get this concept of, well, hold on a second. Is it that Trudeau and Bush and all these people are just so out of touch and lost, or are they playing an agenda that is impenetrable? Are they part of some, he even, in the interview I was listening to on Joe Rogan, it's like, he sort of aligned with the long-standing theory that we've discussed multiple times, which is there are these multiple factions of elite, if you will, that exist. So you, instead of having like, okay, there's one global agenda, but there's these sets of powerful people that are always powering over other people, right? And of course, this is a theory. Everything we're talking about is a theory here, but it's like, that's what my 13 years of research led to was, okay, there's not just one, there's there's these factions that battle against each other, and they're immensely powerful. And yes, maybe they control and lead leaders of the world, different presidents, different prime ministers, whatever. So essentially what I'm trying to do for those listening, I'm differentiating from the perspective that, I often hear David Icke or Alex Jones, or where there's one, elite power that controls the entire world. It's like, no, I think there's factions, right? And so the question then becomes is like, well, are we just trying to appeal to a worldview shift of these leaders, or are they part of a container, part of a system that is agenda driven, that's controlled outside of who is elected? And if so, like, how do you get through to that?
Boy. I think I'm going to come back to what you just said there. But going back to what David said, he made a very interesting comment about Hillary Clinton with her, blindness towards history. Hasn't she learned yet? I believe is what you said. And I think actually what we should be asking is, haven't we learned yet? We haven't learned. What you're suggesting, Joe, is that there's another possibility of what is really going on the planet. Let's take it from the bottom up here. Like we look at it one way and we say they're bad actors out there, and we have to protect ourselves against them. The Putins and the terrorists, or whatever you want to call it. On the other hand, there could be the elite factions that you're talking about, the leaders of these powers, and in order to consolidate power, they need to have a threat. And so we serve, or not we, but these despots around the world need each other in order to justify the authority that they possess. And how do you justify it? Well, you need to have skirmishes. You got to have skirmishes to make sure that people understand that they need authority, that they need protection. I mean, this goes back, centuries. How else would, a king in the Austrian Hungarian Empire justify the need for all of this taxation for their army? They're ruling over a bunch of peasants that could barely feed themselves. The taxpayers show up and they're like, I don't have anything. Why would I give you any money? And they're like, okay, well, we're going to leave. And then 2 weeks later, that village gets burned down by a bunch of people dressed up in, the garb of Huns. This is essentially how you can bring resources to justify your position as a king or to have an army. We're talking about just the sequence of false flags that bring us into conflict all the time. So look, we're hypothesizing here, right? Is there any evidence of this? I think there is, but in this conversation, let's just let it rip. And these kinds of power structures need to justify themselves by creating right. This is a typical David Icke thing, problem solution, whatever, how he likes to call it. But with authority, the threat that they have produced is violence. And therefore, what they have to offer is protection. That's how they justify their position. And look, this is very similar to a lot of other things, big systems that are in play on the planet right now. For example, organized religion, right? What is the threat that they solve? The threat is hell. It's basically, it's been promoted as this is something to fear, and organized religion offers the solution. It's, well, we can offer you salvation. Therefore, you need to listen to us. This consolidates people into a way of thinking that there is a threat that needs to be addressed, and this is the only way. Yeah. And perhaps the biggest power that is doing the same thing right now, we have authority in terms of control of military, we have religion, and then we have the banking system, right? What is the threat that they've created? The threat is, scarcity. How are you going to afford things without us? How are you going to afford a house? How can you afford to send your kid to school? And then what do they do to offer? The solution is loans. But the problem is that they've created the scarcity to begin with because of the control of the monetary supply. Look, I'm jumping all over the place, but we see the same thing happening in all of these large spheres by which we're controlled. Is that the threat or the problem has been created by the very same people that offer a solution, and that drives us into greater and greater separation and fear. And so to put it all together, what I'm suggesting here is that we can look at it as two powers that are fighting, but we must see that in order for them to consolidate authority, they need each other. So are they working together in cahoots? And then this is where we bring it back further. Maybe they are actually being controlled or are subscribing to the same philosophy. That, who knows? Is there someone behind both the Putins and the Bidens and the powers that be? I think there is, and there's no proof of this, but it seems to be a much more coherent picture of what's been happening on the globe. And so that is that's the paradigm that I subscribe to, and I think there's ample evidence that that's going on. That makes sense, because right now we look at what's happening in Ukraine. Is like, why is this going on over there? We just, as you said, we just left this horrible pandemic, and now we want to fight again. Like, what is wrong with us as people? We have to take a close look at who we are as human beings. We don't want this, but yet it's happening anyway. Are we willing to look at the possibility that this is all, that we're being manipulated into thinking this way? I think we are. I'm absolutely certain that we are.
Yeah. It's David, I'll let you respond, but just to summarize, like you're talking about like our worldviews, and a lot of the sort of the words that you added into this mix that is so such a big part of the human story is these ideas of, like you said, fear and scarcity and separation. These are concepts that have been built so deeply into the very premise of how we view life and how we view our culture and how we view, and through these views, which are taught to us, by culture, right, throughout the stages of our progression of learning and becoming people, we adopt them, and then we make all of our decisions and our actions out of those worldviews. And the question is a lot of people are coming to this self-reflective understanding, going, actually, that we don't need to have fear all the time. Wait, we don't need to have scarcity all the time. Like, we've bought into this. And then as they've realizing that this doesn't have to be part of our paradigm, this has to be part of our worldview, they're then going, but it feels like so much of the world is operating and thinking that way. What do? I can't rectify what I feel and believe is possible with what's happening. And how do I then go into that process of transitioning where I can impactfully share these different ideas, these questionings of our worldview, and perhaps bringing in these new ideas in a way where it sparks other people to go, yeah, you know what, you might be right. But then where is the barrier that allows us to implement this into our existing infrastructures and systems, which may be that it can't be done in these systems. Maybe we need to create parallel systems, right? Which is this ongoing, what I'm trying to get at is, like, people are feeling something rise up, a new world, a new ideas birthing out within us. But the question is it's like, okay, what do we do with that? Where do we put it? And how do we play with this? Because right now there's a war happening and people are dying, and that doesn't even make sense in my paradigm. It makes sense in the old paradigm and worldview. But what do I do with that? Where do I sit with that? So David, I'll throw to you to kind of play with whatever Madhava said, or.
For sure. Brilliant explanations there, and just thoughts that I think are fascinating to ponder. And it kind of reminds me of an Iranian poet, and her name escapes me, but essentially what she was saying, and this was at the height of the Pompeo, John Bolton foreign policy in the Trump administration, when they were trying to provoke Iran, right? They were assassinated Soleimani, and essentially were trying to bring us to the precipice of war. And she was referring to the hardliners in Iran who essentially wanted war with the US. And she eloquently said, even more eloquent than I can say, that our leaders are very much alike, and you and I are very much alike, meaning that the people do not want these conflicts. The people in Russia are protesting in the streets. They do not want to see this conflict precipitate. There's a beautiful actually video of even a Russian soldier who was being fed by some Ukrainian women, and he laid down his arms and basically was on FaceTime with his mom crying, right? Essentially, they were finding the commonality, and they, of course, Ukrainians and Russians share a lineage and share linguistic traditions and cultural traditions as well. But I think it brings us back to the important point that we have to delegitimize and decentralize the power centers, and and to where we're constantly just deferring and letting them make these huge decisions for everyone.
Yeah.
And we also have to examine where the media is complicit, because I think days ago I watched a clip of Sean Hannity where he was essentially suggesting that we should bomb the 40-mile convoy that's taking part miles away from Kiev right now. We should just bomb all of them and just say, hey, we didn't do it, so that Putin doesn't know who did it, knowing that if we did this, this would lead to World War III. And we don't have to go back very far to see where the media beat the war drum leading up to the Iraq War, complicit. New York Times peddling knowing lies about weapons of mass destruction that got us into that conflict.
Yeah.
Both are suggesting we do have to examine the intersectionality of all these power structures, all these institutions that perhaps are conspiring in unison in a very intentional way, not only to deceive and keep us in the dark and keep us separate from each other, both in terms of having a universal solidarity to where we can actually have a chance of global harmony, but also deceiving us in a way that makes us in a state of scarcity to where we feel like we have to rely on these power structures to secure our well-being, to secure our resources, right? And obviously the conflict in Ukraine has a lot to do with resources. Ukraine is a resource-rich country. Putin knows that, NATO knows that, Biden knows that. And this conflict already with Nord Stream 2 being shut down, it's going to cause a massive spike in energy prices, which is only going to make people feel that pressure of scarcity even more so. And when we're in that state of shock, in that state of scarcity, we are prevented from, first of all, relaxing our shoulders a bit and coming from a place where we can actually perceive abundance, find that universal commonality with each other. And that, I think, is the clear and present danger here, is that these elite forces across the world are preventing us from really accessing the universalism that we all share together as humanity.
Yeah, well said. I like what I would like to highlight. What you just said there was the story about the Russian soldier being fed by the Ukrainian women. Because as we witness what's going on from 14,000 miles away here in the United States, in the Ukraine, we wonder, like, what can we do?
Yeah,
and there's very little that we can do, honestly. Other than keep a calm perspective and send love and prayers. Honestly, that's actually more useful than we realize. But where the rubber hits the road is what you just described there, David, with the Russian soldier, the one that puts down his arms and calls his mom and cries and accepts the handouts from the Ukrainians that he's supposed to be attacking. This is the revolution. This is how it's going to play out. It happens on a personal level, and we as three sovereign beings having a conversation and exchanging ideas is very important. But right now the focus is going to be on the folks carrying the guns into Ukraine with Russian guns. They have to put down the guns and say, look, this is ridiculous. Like you said, I share a common linguistic background, and we've shared a border that goes on for 8,000 miles. They have to put down the guns, and it reminds me of the police officers in Ottawa that just said, this is ridiculous. I'm not gonna do it. Very few, but that's where it starts. And look, I'm going to be very frank here that I feel like I'm in the same position as a physician in this country right now, speaking out against what I believe is a massive conspiracy against public health. We may not all agree upon that. I know that, but that's the way I see it. And there is a sacrifice. The Russian soldier is sacrificing. He may be kicked out of his position, The police officer in Ottawa lost his job. Physicians who are speaking out against the narrative are losing their licenses. But that is what it's going to take. It honestly takes that kind of sacrifice in order to break down the system. We're not going to be able to invade Russia and, like you said, bomb them and fix things. We as human beings, especially the ones that are being caught in this, have to put down our arms and open our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is interestingly where, like, even contextualizing it for, this type of conversation. And sometimes when we're thinking about, I know I can say this from the, a lot of the community that we've built around the years. A lot of people, when they say, oh, but it's all just love and light, hold positivity, and things will kind of work itself out. And that's what our role is. But it's like, it feels as though it's like you were saying about what it's going to take is putting down your guns, and what it's going to take is leaving your position and facing what's there. And there may be some struggle, that may not be, it may be a lot of resistance. It may not be that you just, that police officer, I know one of the officers, like, he quit, and, he was recently just arrested, and all these different little things happened in that person's life. And, it's part of the time we're in, right? Like to adopt these changes and to have moral courage and stand up in a sense, and say, I'm going to do this. It's not always a smooth, sailing road, no matter how much positivity you hold in your perspective. We're in a physical material reality for the moment that can produce some rocky roads as we go through and do this. And it's why it almost kind of feels like, if we're kind of taking this deeper, this like, how do we talk about these possibilities and a shift in our worldview, and how do we then action them? How do we then, okay, if we're going to hold this space of, yeah, we are connected and we are this and we are that, well, is it enough to just hold it? Or is it that we also have to then act upon it and leave that job, as you have, Madhava, or, seeing some of the officers, stand down, or seeing a soldier, stand down. This is part of the story of that change and that resistance, and these events, these Russian-Ukraine conflicts. As much as people will say, well, it's just negative, don't even talk about that, that's just war, you don't want it. The more you talk about that, the more you're going to just create it in the reality. But it's through these stories, and this is a human story. What's happening right now is that's a part of our human experience. And when we talk about it, we reflect. When we talk about it, we ask, what is driving this? Like, what about our humanness? What about our current culture? What about our current nature is driving this? And there's so much to learn. And there's so much to learn from looking at that, if you will, that shadow, that collective shadow that exists within our society. And I wanted to kind of throw some of that stuff out there, because I know a lot of people listening are fatigued, right? They're fatigued by this feeling that I can't handle looking at what's happening in the world anymore. And there's an invitation to saying, well, I just want to look at what's positive all the time. And, that's a whole thing to unpack on its own. Like, yes, if you know deep within your being, like, look, I need to take a break and just, not look at media for 5 days, that's different, right? Take a break. But to disconnect from the nature of our reality, to disconnect from our current human story, and pretend that these things aren't happening because we got to stay positive, I'm not sure that that's going to move us forward all that much, right? So, I just kind of wanted to put that out as this idea of, like, part of what our greater story is it feels to me we're in this time of change, this time of transition, this time where we can welcome these deeper conversations, these metaphysical ideas, these massive cultural shifts, and keep it in a space that's grounded in that allows us to allows it to be actionable. And that it's not just going to be this beautiful utopia that just emerges out of nowhere, but that we know that that's on the other side of something that's going to come one step at a time. And to hold that as like a deeper vision, but being willing to engage, like being willing to engage in doing something. And I'm not saying, picking up a gun and doing something, but having these conversations and acknowledging that this is part of the transition. This is kind of what we're going through on a deeper level.
100%. And Joe, you touched on something very important. I just want to quickly comment on, which is sort of this trend in sort of the New Age movement to create a hyper filter around our world, to where everything has to be utopian. And by acknowledging darkness in the world, that means somehow we're giving into that energy when we're just acknowledging what's happening on the ground. I think a lot of times, if you just look at the wellness influencer culture that is now pervasive, you would think that all you have to do is really meditate on a mountain and eat goji berries and the world is going to be fine, right? But, if I think we actually have a duty not to shield our eyes away from injustice and things that are happening in the world. And I actually think it's instructive in the Ukraine situation, because there are a lot of people, Europeans, for example, who are acting so outraged and shocked by what's happening here. But we're essentially numb to what's been happening in Yemen and Syria and Iraq for decades, essentially because they don't share that cultural commonality there. And there's a sense of, we can just kind of live our lives and put these utopian filters on our reality, as long as it doesn't affect our immediate future, right? Or as long as it doesn't affect our immediate tribe even. But this is where I think it becomes important to explore who you really are. Meaning, once you strip away your skin, your gender identity, your ethnic identity, your religious affiliation, all of these factors, would you recognize yourself? Who are you outside of all of that? Who are we, right, as human beings? If we are simply a collection of these identities that are constantly in competition and constantly divided, then we're never going to be able to get beyond this. And I think one of the most important things we have to do in order to move on and progress and create a more sustainable, just world is to first acknowledge the darkness that is here, right? First acknowledge the forces that are in our reality in the exoteric world, and not always just safely retreat into an esoteric imaginary dream space.
Yeah.
As comforting as that may be, which I don't think is actually going to pay dividends to get to where we need to be at this time.
Yes. And look, I would say that, the threat here are not these people in power, honestly. The threat is the division that you're alluding to here. How do you feel about the Ukraine crisis? Are you pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian? How do you feel about what's going on in Yemen? Are we putting out narratives that condemn people for caring about Ukraine but ignoring what's happening in Syria? This is what's coming out of the media. It's like, look, they're bad. Those people aren't with you. When you're afraid, you resort to tribalism. You want to be comfortable in your group. So you find who agrees with you so that you can feel secure. That is actually a very powerful tool of the power structures that are in play right now. And by the power structure, I'm talking possibly about one below, banking is the media. The media is fractioning us into all kinds of little pieces for a reason. We have the blue and the red. We have the masked and unmasked. We have the vaxxed and unvaxxed. We're being divided in every single way, shape, or form by every single narrative that's being pushed. Every narrative that's being pushed is being polarized into like, there must be, you're either this way or that way. I believe that's being done on purpose. I honestly believe that keeps us thinking, geez, I'm going to go with these people. But then that group doesn't actually believe in this. So then I have another subgroup that believes in both of these things. And we have this Venn diagram that, keeps getting smaller and smaller little, subsets and subsets that are all designed to keep us ununified in our way of thinking. And I don't know what you have to say about that, but I think that's the biggest problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask something quick, because I know people have posed this question to me before, and it's almost like, okay, well, if it's in our nature in a sense, and we can argue what that term really means, but to resort to tribalism in these times of difficulty, in these times of crisis, in these times of challenge, then can we expect anything different? Right? That's the question they'll ask. Well, but it's human nature then to be tribal. It's human nature then to do that. And I'd be curious as to how you guys think about, that type of question.
Well, now we're getting really metaphysical, Joe. It's how deep you want to go. Do you consider yourself, like David brought this up, like, skin color, ethnic background, religion? How do you identify? I mean, like, deeply look at that. Do you walk around saying, I am this? I'm, Italian Canadian. I'm Indian American. Whatever it is. Is that how you identify? What are you actually saying when you say, I am a doctor, I am a journalist, I am an attorney? Is that what you are? Language is a very, very powerful tool to indoctrinate us. And if you keep going deeper and deeper, where do you end up? You'll end up with something that is beyond all of these labels, right? Eventually. And you're going to find yourself saying, I don't really know who I am. I'm just experiencing things. Mm-hmm. It's just one experience after another. That's what it is. And, I'm coloring the experience based on my background, but that background didn't exist before you were born. And, look, if you really believe that you are an entity that has a beginning and an end, right away, you can be manipulated. Mm-hmm. As soon as you buy into the fact that when death arrives, I'm done, you can be manipulated left and right. And that is what's happening right now. It's like, I'm going to die in 20 years. I have to maximize everything I have right now. A little bit longer for you guys. But, as long as you buy into that, they'll just come in and say, look, if you don't fight, we're going to kill you. If you don't, work harder, you're not going to keep up with the Joneses. That's what's behind all of this. So if you go deep enough, you'll realize that it's just a set of experiences that are happening. And how do you want to color those experiences? Out of, fear? And that's when you can dismantle the idea that we need to be in a tribe. We are in a tribe, but there's only one tribe. If there's only one tribe, is it truly a tribe? It isn't.
100%. Yeah, I think, also there's a crisis of empathy here, to the point where there's this inability, I think, en masse to not put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. So what do I mean by that? In the United States, we're familiar with the concept of American exceptionalism. If you looked at a lot of the reporting on the Iraq War, on the casualties, there was a constant news ticker about American soldiers who were killed, but complete rejection and just a dismissal of the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives that died, right? It was just like collateral damage. It's just a byproduct of war, that there was no real empathy about that. I think one of the more powerful demonstrations that we can do as a humanity when it comes to COVID-19 and the vaccine controversy is when you see people together holding a sign, I'm vaccinated, I'm unvaccinated, and I'm against these mandates, right? Because regardless of my feelings on the vaccine, what I do stand for is your right to bodily integrity. There were another protest in Texas protesting against Governor Abbott's authoritarian abortion proposal, where people were standing together and saying, hey, regardless of our competing views on abortion, the government shouldn't be the arbiter to make that decision between what is sacred in your own body, right? Preserving your bodily integrity. And I think this challenges us to think beyond these cultural identifiers, this tribalism, to the point where we have to reach for something much more universal that binds us together. And that's why I think the movement for bodily autonomy and integrity is important, because if they can strip that away from us and have us sort of compartmentalized to the point where either you're a pro-vaxxer or an anti-vaxxer, and if you're on the other side, then there's no middle ground and we can't actually stand for universal principles for each other, then there's a real problem there. And on the death ticker, we all know about the COVID-19 death ticker, that they have like a stock, like a Bloomberg stock ticker all day long on CNN, right? And but what about the people who have died from other causes, right? What about the people who have died because they couldn't get into the doctor because the healthcare system's overrun, or people who perhaps died because of the vaccine, right? Like, even acknowledging that is just outrageous for mainstream media these days. The idea that a vaccine could cause an injury, which we can get into, and I'm sure that would be a fun discussion. But this idea that we only can identify with those who agree with us, who look like us, who speak like us, who hold our same views, is creating this crisis of empathy all across the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because like in a lot of this stuff, whether it be COVID, whether it be this, whether it be all these things, like when you're in the middle of the crisis, say, people say we don't have the luxury, or depending on the type of life we live, like here we're able to take some time and have this conversation. There's other people on this planet experiencing a life where they may not have this time, right? They're working to support, they're doing what they need to do, and they may only have 5-10 minutes a day to ponder this type of stuff. And not everybody's in the same boat, but it's like, I also have this inclination, this curiosity, this like, when I look at events like this happening, when I look at Ukraine, when I look at COVID, and I go, what does it mean to live? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean? Like, and then I reflect, okay, in my Western experience, we never talk about this. Like I'm not prompted in my culture, growing up, going to school, going to this, I'm learning all these material facts. I'm learning all these, these concepts of, maybe in philosophy, like I took philosophy, a couple courses and you play with stuff, but it doesn't start to make its way into larger culture because it's not a priority, right? But larger culture ends up being whatever is closer to whatever the culture is at that time. Usually around economics, usually around how we look, usually around our successes, usually around sports, maybe current events, but it's like that question of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live can inform an immense amount of decision-making with regards to something like COVID or with regards to something like Ukraine and Russia and these very real events that we're having. But we don't consider, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to experience? What do I want that to look like? And in that same moment, you're juxtaposed in this position where you're like, people are shaming me for asking this question while that crisis is happening because, I have the privilege to ask that question. But it's like, yeah, but are we not potentially in a worldview changing moment? Like, are we not potentially in a time where we can't solve our crisis without starting to ask these questions? And yeah, maybe not every single one of us can at this moment, but maybe some of us can, and start sharing that and start reflecting that and distilling that and then sharing that with others and then allowing that to continue to mold and evolve. Like, these are, I don't know, these are just kind of the deeper thoughts that, we have these thoughts. What do we do with them? Where do we go with it?
Yeah. Well, look, let's pay attention to how often the idea that you just floated there, like we're at a moment of, a planetary awakening, a big shift is happening. How often does that get made fun of? Like,
Yeah.
Oh, you believe that? Why is that? Like, where is the cynicism there? Like, what is driving the need to make fun of anybody who suggests that could be happening?
Mm-hmm.
Where's that coming from? But you asked a really good question about what to do, especially if you have only 5 or 10 minutes. What does it mean to be alive? Even with only 5 or 10 minutes, I would say that we need to connect with our own bodies. Mm-hmm. We need to connect with our internal experience, devoid of any input from computers, phones, books, conversations, and sit and notice. And, this is a very, very profound practice. I'm not sure where we all stand, the viewers, or where are you, but when was the last time you just sat down and just felt your body for 10 minutes as closely as you possibly could? Do your best. There's a lot to be explored there. And I believe that this is a very important part of the shift that's happening here. Is we have to unplug from this of other people telling us what to think and what to pay attention to, and pay attention to the internal experience. And I truly believe that will answer a lot of questions about what does it mean to be alive. How's that for waxing metaphysical?
It's an excellent point. I think one of my favorite memes of our time is somebody who's actually out in nature and they're sitting with themselves, as Madhav is suggesting. And I think the meme says, somewhere somebody is wholly unaware that they should be frightened, scared, and outraged what's going on in the world, right? Because, if you think about it, there are some areas of the planet where people are living more close to their indigenous traditions and aren't turning on the TV every day to try to make sense of the world. They're actually going inward. And I'm not saying that we all should sort of abandon our lives and move into the jungle per se, but I think it should be, I think it's a very essential practice to take some time to do that. Because again, if we're just constantly receiving downloads from media and external sources, and we're never taking that time to go through the internal discernment process, we're essentially being voluntarily taken away from arguably the most profound element of being a human being, which is our internal world, right? Which really transcends everything we know about the skin suit we're wearing and who we think we are based on where we were born and what language we speak. If we have no connection to that, then clearly we're much more easily herded into groupthink, which I find ourselves in at this time.
Yeah. It's sort of like the way you guys both put it, I think resonates on the level of like, we're this consciousness, but this is our body, and this consciousness is deeply connected to that body, and this, it's part of who we are, and getting in tune and getting in touch with that is like getting in tune and in touch with a more expanded version of ourselves, a more almost like the totality of our capacity. Maybe not in the sense of if we, I mean, there's been a number of instances of this, but like people who almost have an experience where Jill Bolte Taylor's like the one example where she had a stroke on the left side of her brain, and therefore she immediately, her awareness expanded beyond, she couldn't even fit in her body. I mean, that's, a bit of a going to another layer of awareness. But this idea of being well regulated in our system, well regulated in our body, and really, that we did in our membership, the Explorer Lounge, we did a piece called Physiology of Sense Making, and it was kind of like a little webinar workshop type thing that discussed how, getting back into the body is also a huge part of the process of how we then interpret our reality accurately. Right. And so there's, how much from a priority perspective, or how much time do we put getting back into our body versus watching a 3-hour Joe Rogan episode, right? We're willing to do that, but are we willing to spend 10 minutes? I mean, the exercises with that webinar is 10 minutes long. Hey, do this 10 minutes, for the next like 30 days and get back into your body. Use your senses to filter what's around you back into your body. Pay attention, develop a relationship with it, welcome regulation into your system, and then watch how your social engagement changes. Watch how the relationships improve in your life. Watch how suddenly your intuition kind of comes a little more on board, and suddenly you're making sense of your reality, not just from a logical, but from a richer feeling point of view as well. Like there's so much there, and it's just interesting how our culture will prioritize what we do. And getting too stuck in the mind sometimes.
Yeah. Well, look, right there with this whole getting the body thing is another enormous question to ponder, which is we typically say that our body is why we're aware of it. It's giving rise to our awareness. But if you really look at that deeply, it's just as reasonable to say that your body and your feelings of your body are arising in your awareness first.
Yes.
Right. That's where these kinds of exercise lead you. And that possibly is the most profound paradigm shift to see that as being actually the, reality. And that changes everything, like that's kind of what war is based on, right? We're just identified with this body that's limited, and therefore we must protect it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect ourselves, but look, this is part, that's the kind of conversation we're hoping to have here. I think you break all that apart, and then, we're all just something completely different.
Yeah. The layers and depths of who we are, as opposed to just, I'm just the body, and I'm just the mind that's producing the consciousness. But I'm actually like an awareness that's built in a sense that's placed in a sense, like in this body, in this mind, connected to all these pieces that become almost the totality of who I am for that period of time. Right. And then when you pass, there's a part of it that continues on, right? Or however you want to look at it. But it's like kind of, I guess, breaking down that piece of like, what does it mean? Like, we're not just the body, but we're also not the body, right? There's all these different sort of layers to what makes us, I guess, in this moment in time, who we are, sort of thing.
That's heavy, man.
Wow, lots of things to play with there. That's probably even a longer conversation. Anything else you want to add here before? I mean, pretty much got to cap a lot of this off.
Yeah, I would like to say something just to finish. And this goes back to what we are talking about with like what has to happen on a personal level. You know, when we cited the Russian soldier and the police officers and doctors, but this is a shout out to you, Joe, because you're taking a stand. We all know here how easy. Well, first of all, how hard it's been for the Pulse to fund all of the activities that are so valuable, and better than anyone else that. It would have been a lot easier just to create fear porn or take extreme views, but you chose to take the middle way and bring us clarity. So you're one of the warriors out there too. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Appreciate you guys both coming on here as well and aligning with the middle ground warriors. It's a dangerous place to be. David, any final words?
Yeah, it's funny they talk about that radical middle ground, if you will. I think I heard an interesting perspective that we're sort of identifying this groundwork we're trying to operate in as the alt middle, right? Mm-hmm. I thought that was a hilarious term, but and it's not so much that it's like centrist per se, as much as it is a sense of neutrality and balance, right? Which we're really aiming for here, and I think this calls upon us to. To be measured and to be introspective in terms of how we're looking at the world. And what I mean by that is we have to be suspicious and scrutinize mainstream media, but we also have to keep that same level of scrutiny for alternative media, right? Because there is a tendency, as Madhava said, to just sensationalize and catastrophize everything to create fear porn because it's going to play well with an audience. Like if, Fox News and CNN, they know what is going to essentially get their clicks and get their ad revenue up, and they perpetuate that every day. And, I want to also echo what Madhava said about my respect and admiration for what the Pulse is doing, because it is trying to find that alt middle space or the radical balance, if you will, to say that, hey, we have to have some kind of independence from all of these competing interests, because otherwise we're just tuning in to say, hey, tell me what to think.
Yeah.
Instead of learning how to think, right?
Yeah.
We're in this critical thinking crisis. Outlets like the Pulse become the gold, I think, in people's consciousness. So just want to say big love and respect to both of you. It's always an honor to exchange. And, we could go on for hours, of course. And